and gentlemen, put your hands together for Walter Borden.
When I was 6 years old in 1948, in grade 1, I arrived home from school one day and I was called into my living room before I even had time to take off my school bag. In the room was my mother's sister, Aunt Sadie, and a white woman, whom my mother and my aunt called Mrs. Wilson. Mrs. Wilson called my mother and my aunt Ethel and Sadie. My Aunt Sadie was a day worker for Mrs. Wilson in a town about 40 miles from where we lived. I stood there in the middle of that room while this Mrs. Wilson patted my blonde hair, stroked my pale face, and gazed into my blue eyes. I stared at my mother and my aunt. They stared at Mrs. Wilson. Mrs. Wilson stared at me. I wanted to cry, but my mother and my aunt were beaming at Mrs. Wilson, and Mrs. Wilson was beaming at me, so I didn't. But as soon as I was allowed to go, I ran and hid under the front porch steps until Mrs. Wilson and my aunt left. And as soon as they were gone, I went into my bedroom. And I took the brown and white crayons out of my box of crayons, and I hid the brown one under the clothes in my dresser drawer. Then I went down to the kitchen, and I held the white one in the fire until it completely melted away. I never mentioned that for 35 years, but as a child, I always removed the brown and white crayons from every box of crayons I ever owned. Now, around that same time, I started to notice how the people in my community, including relatives, treated me as opposed to how they treated darker-skinned children in the neighborhood, many of whom were also my relatives. Now, my grandmother, who was Black and Native, and my step-great-grandmother, who was white, loved me to death and made no bones about it. But they were absolutely vicious, mean, and cruel to the darker-skinned children in that neighborhood. And I can remember that being so hard on me that I never mentioned it to anybody. Now, who could I talk to about that? But I did try to do everything I possibly could to always positively include my friends into any conversation that we might be having with those people who seemed determined to drive this wedge between us, because I knew my friends were totally aware of how differently they were being treated and why, and that it hurt them a great deal. That was rough. But I was learning a lot about this color thing, so I started watching what was going on outside my community, in the larger community, especially in school. Now, I didn't know anything about race at that particular point in time, so it never factored into my thinking. That would all come later. Now, desegregation didn't officially occur in the school system in Nova Scotia until 1954. That's when I was in grade 7. However, the schools in my hometown of New Glasgow had never been segregated, although it was customary for Blacks in the generations preceding mine to leave school early, go to work because they had to. I mean, my dad only went to grade 5, my mom went to grade 6. But my dad's younger sister, Pearline, she was the first Black student to graduate from our high school. The strange anomaly was that the schools in New Glasgow seemingly operated in a bubble within the racism that existed outside in the rest of the town. I mean, there were segregated restaurants, movie houses, various other establishments, and two adjacent towns, and Black people never went to because they weren't welcome there, even though many of the men from my community worked in the coal mines in one of those towns, and many of them died there, including my grandfather. But the rule of the day was, when the shift was over, you better not be found hanging around. In two other nearby towns, there were ordinances that declared that blacks had to be out of town by 6 p.m. And they're still on the books in one of those places because they haven't gotten around to taking it off. They're still just sitting there. I remember my mother telling me when she was a little girl, between 1914 and 1918, her mother often told her about the only race riot that ever happened in Glasgow. That was around the beginning of the 20th century. Well, word has spread through the community. White people are on their way to run the blacks off Nigger Hill. That's the name that they gave to Dale Road, our community. Well, there was this old black gentleman who lived in the neighborhood who had fought with the British in the First Boer War, 1880-1881. And when he returned home, he had brought a machine gun home with him. So he set that gun up in the middle of the road. And when the folks came charging up over the hill, he let loose of all the over their heads, and off they took back down that road, never to return. I remember loving that story because it made me think about cheering for the Indians when I'd be watching a cowboy movie. Anyway, during my school years, in spite of this seemingly progressive attitude in the schools, I was always well aware that I was treated differently than my darker skinned classmates by my teachers up to a point. And I always hoped that it was because of my, academic performance, which was always at a very high level. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. And Mrs. Wilson was never far from my mind. I mean, there were always those little things going down that made me see very clearly that when the chickens came home to roost, I occupied the same position as every other black child in that school. So to offset what I experienced outside of my community, although I had begun to seriously think about why and how that external behavior seemed to mirror itself in so many ways within my community, I still relied on my church, which was certainly the heart and soul of the community. But even there, I was singled out, favored. And it struck me, much to my dismay, that people didn't even realize they were doing it. More important to me, why? So, my great salvation during those rough, tough, formative years was my access to Ebony magazine, sepia, coppertone, and jet. Every month, my parents arranged to have them brought in by the one bookstore in town, ironically named, as far as I was concerned, White's Bookstore. I would pick them up, I'd take them home, and I would devour them. And those magazines made me start to see myself in a very different way. I remember when I used to have to give oral compositions in class, bombarding the students and the teachers with stories about Paul Robeson, Marcus Garvey, and Ralph Bunche, Jackie Robinson, Roy Campanella, Joe Louis, Eddie Armstrong, Sugar Ray Robinson, Patrice Lumumba, Jomo Kenyatta, Kwame Nkrumah, the Mau Mau, Lena Horne, Marian Anderson, Leontine Price, Josephine Baker, on and on and on. And most of the time they didn't have a clue who or what I was talking about, and I certainly didn't care. That was soul food to me, and that was the only dish that was on the menu. And I can tell you this, by the time I finished school and headed out to start the next phase of my life, I knew about race and to what extent it would play center stage in my life. That was just a foregone conclusion. Now that phase could be described as an amalgamation of teaching, artistic output, and activism, each of the entities constantly feeding off each other. And whether I was in a classroom, on stage, in a march, giving a political speech, or organizing inmates in some prison, confronting the complexities of race was always front and center. But it was at this same phase that I met what I call the mighty people who not only nourished me and kept me sane, but who ultimately fashioned me into the person that I had to become in order to achieve what I was destined to do because of the path I had chosen to follow. Just the other week, I was back in Nova Scotia, and I sat at the same big, round oak table across which I had talked into the early hours of the morning to Stokely Carmichael and Miriam McKeeva, Harry Belafonte and Odetta, listening and being listened to 50 years ago. And I rewalked the streets that over 40 years ago I had walked with my greatest mentor, Dr. Josephine Jochenen, Dr. Ben. He was heading up the Africana Studies Research Center at Cornell University, as he guided me back across the millennia to the source of who I really was. And I tell you this, that during that phase, my constant companions were the books and essays of James Borden and the works of Frantz Fanon and Nikki Giovanni. So that's the solid foundation under which I now stand as I try to do whatever I can to help the activist generation of the day. I tell them when they come asking for advice that they're leading the charge now. The furthest thing from my mind is challenging in any way that they are the leaders whom I am committed to follow. And I tell them I can be of help to them, not because I was always right, but because I have more experience in being wrong. And that their success is contingent upon not repeating those wrongs. And I remind them that regardless of whatever else they might master, nuanced critical analysis, which will bring them their greatest rewards, is the most cherished offspring of listening. And furthermore, those among them who have been gifted with the ability for brilliant strategizing are the most important people in the movement. And other than that, all I can tell them is I'm nature's love child, a witness and a messenger, and freedom is my father. I was born to be a griot, but I have been called by many other names, and I am called by many still not. Restless is the name they gave me, and I am fashioned from the wind. Born on some forgotten Friday, that's Friday with a Y, not Friday with an I. At half-past discontent, when Mama sat down on life's sidewalk, spread her legs and pushed when ain't no problem time, and spewed me there. Where maybe you will, child, Boulevard cuts across, maybe you won't, child. And indifference sauntered by to serve as midwife to wrap me in my soul and say, like nature's love child, a witness and a messenger. Freedom's your father. You'll be called by many names. I am called by many still. Restless is the name they gave me, and I am fashioned from the wind. Thank you for letting me spend this time with you.